Alright guys, this is video 1 for APUSH for Friday, March 27th. We're also, just as a reminder, we're 1 week away from discovering when the AP exam test dates will be, so make sure you are doing review as much as you can. We left off yesterday with the Stamp Act being revoked by Parliament in Britain. We started the APUSH Unit 3 key concepts. So we're going to review some of those key concepts as well today, and I'll make sure to post about them in the Moodle as well. So let's pick it up from where we left off yesterday. We just talked about the Declaratory Act. Now we're looking at the Townshend Acts. Rockingham remained Prime Minister for only 2 years. His replacement was William Pitt. Pitt, however, was ill, and the dominant figure in colonial affairs came to be the Minister of Exchequer, Charles Townshend. Townshend drafted the eponymous Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts, like the Stamp Act, contained several antagonistic measures. First, they taxed goods imported directly from Britain, the first such tax in the colonies. Mercantilism approved of duties on imports from other European nations, but not on British imports. Second, some of the tax collected was set aside for the payment of tax collectors, meaning that colonial assemblies could no longer withhold government officials' wages in order to get their way. Third, the Townshend Acts created even more vice admiralty courts and several new government offices to enforce the Crown's will in the colonies. Fourth, they suspended the New York legislature because it had refused to comply with a law requiring the colonists to supply British troops. Last, these acts instituted writs of assistance, licenses that gave the British power to search any place they suspected of hiding smuggled goods. The colonists got better at protesting with each new tax, and their reaction to the Townshend Acts was their strongest yet. The Massachusetts Assembly sent a letter called the Massachusetts Circular Letter, written by Samuel Adams, to all other assemblies asking that they protest the new measures in unison. The British fanned the flames of protest by ordering the assemblies not to discuss the Massachusetts letter, virtually guaranteeing that it would be all anyone would talk about. Governors of colonies where legislatures discussed the letter dissolved those legislatures, which of course further infuriated colonists. The colonists held numerous rallies and organized boycotts and for the first time sought the support of commoners. Previous such protests were confined largely to the aristocratic classes, making their rallies larger and much more intimidating. The boycotts were most successful because they affected British merchants who then joined the protests. Colonial women were essential in the effort to replace British imports with American New England products. After 2 years, Parliament repealed the Townshend Act duties, although not the other statutes of the Townshend Acts and not the duty on tea. More on that later on. The Quartering Act of 1765. The Quartering Act of 1765 stationed large numbers of troops in America and made the colonists responsible for the cost of feeding and housing them. Even after the Townshend duties were repealed, the soldiers remained, particularly in Boston. Officially sent to keep the peace, these soldiers in fact heightened tensions. For one thing, the detachment was huge, 4,000 men in the city of only 16,000. To make matters worse, the soldiers sought off-hour employment and so competed with colonists for jobs. Numerous confrontations resulted, with the most famous on March 5, 1770, when a mob pelted a group of soldiers with rock-filled snowballs. The soldiers fired on the crowd, killing 5, hence the Boston Massacre, and that's, of course, where Crispus Attucks was killed. The propaganda campaign that followed suggested that the soldiers had shot into a crowd of innocent bystanders, drawn by Patrick Henry. Interestingly, John Adams defended the soldiers in court, hoping to establish a tradition of giving a fair trial to all who are accused. Then I have the non-consumption, non-importation. There were no police departments in colonial America. Communities were self-policing. If a man was beating his wife, groups of neighbors would gather and threaten him with dire consequences if he didn't stop. Patriot leaders leveraged this practice in organizing resistance to Townshend and other duties. The colonists' only recourses were non-consumption and non-importation. In other words, to boycott British goods, but such a policy would be effective only if everyone participated. So it was that New England newspapers printed pleas to the women in particular, who generally managed the family budget, not to buy British linen, and to expose importers such as one William Jackson, who ran a shop called the Brazen Head. If these methods proved ineffective, then yes, Patriot leaders would deploy thugs to get their point across. A few painful, humiliating tar and featherings went a long way. Imports from Britain dropped 40% by 1770. The calm and then the storm. Oddly enough, and for the next 2 years, nothing major happened. The Boston Massacre shocked both sides into de-escalating their rhetoric. An uneasy status quo fell into place during this period. Colonial newspapers discussed ways in which the relationship between the mother country and the colonies might be altered so as to satisfy both sides. But still, nobody except very few radicals suggested independence. Things picked up in 1772 when the British implemented the part of the Townshend Acts and provided for colonial administrators to be paid from customs revenues and not by the colonial legislatures. The colonists responded cautiously, setting up the groups called Committees of Correspondence throughout the colonies to trade ideas and inform one another of a political mood. The committees also worked to convince more citizens to take an active interest in the conflict. Not long after the British granted the foundering East India Tea Company a monopoly on tea trade in the colonies, as well as a portion of new duties to be collected on tea sales. The result was cheaper tea for the colonists, but the colonists saw a more important issue. Parliament was once again imposing new taxes on them, and even though it was cheaper than before. In Boston, the colonists refused to allow the ships to unload their cargo, and the governor refused to allow them to leave the harbor. On December 16, 1773, a group of Sons of Liberty, poorly disguised as Mohawks, boarded a ship and dumped its cargo into Boston Harbor. It took them about 3 hours to jettison the approximately 10,000 pounds worth of tea. The incident is known as the Boston Tea Party. The English then responded, and this is like where the slippery slope now begins with the Boston Tea Party in 73 all the way to the Revolution breaking out in 75, 76. The English responded with a number of punitive measures, known collectively as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts, as they were called in the colonies. One measure closed Boston Harbor to all but essential trade, food and firewood, and declared that it would remain closed until the tea was paid for. Several measures tightened English control over the Massachusetts government and its courts, and a new stricter quarantining act put British soldiers in civilian homes. The Coercive Acts convinced many colonists that their days of semi-autonomy were over, and that the future held even further encroachments on their liberties by the Crown. To make matters worse, at the same time Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, it also passed the Quebec Act, which the colonists' chagrin, number one, granted greater liberties to Catholics whom the Protestant colony majority distrusted, and two, extended the boundaries of the Quebec territory, thus furthering impending western expansion. The colonists met to discuss their grievances. All colonies except Georgia sent delegates to the First Continental Congress, which convened in 1774. All perspectives were represented. Pennsylvania's delegation included conservatives like Joseph Galloway, while Virginia sent two radicals, Richard Henry Lee and Patrick Henry. The goals of the meeting were to enumerate the American grievances, to develop a strategy for addressing those grievances, and to formulate a colonial position on the proper relationship between the royal government and the colonial governments. The Congress came up with a list of those laws that the colonists wanted repealed and agreed to impose a boycott on British goods until their grievances were redressed. The delegates also agreed to form a continental association, with towns setting up committees of observation to enforce the boycott. In time, these committees became their town's de facto governments. Perhaps more important, the Congress formulated a limited set of parameters within which it considered parliamentary interference in colonial affairs justified. All other spheres, the delegation agreed, should be left to the colonists themselves. This position represented a major break with British tradition and accordingly a major step forward towards independence. We're going to stop video 1 there.